Chapter 5 of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5 The Plot. The sequel to the events of this evening may be told very briefly, and of it the reader can form his own judgment. I narrate it as it happened. That night I did not sleep at all well. It may have been because of the excitement of the great shoot in which I found myself in competition with another man whom I disliked and who had defrauded me in the past, to say nothing of its physical strain in cold and heavy weather. Or it may have been that my imagination was stirred by the arrival of that strange pair, Harût and Marût, apparently in search of myself, 7,000 miles away from any place where they can have known aught of an insignificant individual of a purely local repute. Or it may have been that the pictures which they showed me when under the influence of the fumes of their tobacco or of their hypnotism took an undue possession of my brain. Or lastly, the strange coincidence that the beautiful betrothed of my host should have related to me a tale of her childhood of which she declared she had never spoken before, and that within an hour the two principal actors in that tale should have appeared before my eyes and hers, for I may state that from the beginning I had no doubt that they were the same men, moved me and filled me with a quite natural foreboding. Or all these things together may have tended to a concomitant effect. At any rate, the issue was that I could not sleep. For hour after hour I lay thinking and in an irritated way listening for the chimes of the Ragnall stable clock which once had adorned the tower of the church and struck the quarters with a damnable reiteration. I concluded that Messrs. Harût and Marût were a couple of common Arab rogues such as I had seen performing in the African ports. Then a quarter struck and I concluded that the elephants' cemetery which I beheld in the smoke undoubtedly existed, and that I meant to collar those thousands of pounds worth of ivory before I died. Then after another quarter I concluded that there was no elephants' cemetery, although by the way my old friend Dogeetah or Brother John had mentioned such a thing to me, but that probably there was a tribe, as he had also mentioned, called the Kender, who worshipped a baby, or rather its effigy. Well now, as had already occurred to me, the old Egyptians, of whom I was always fond of reading when I got a chance, also worshipped a child, Horus the Saviour, and that child had a mother called Isis, symbolized in the crescent moon, the great nature goddess, the mistress of mysteries, to whose cult 10,000 priests were sworn. Do not Herodotus and others, especially Apuleius, tell us all about her? And by a queer coincidence Miss Holmes had the mark of a crescent moon upon her breast. And when she was a child those two men, or others very like them, had pointed out that mark to each other, and I had seen them staring hard at it that night. And in her vapour-invoked dream the heavenly child, alias Horus, or the double of Horus, the Ka, I think the Egyptians called it, had awakened at the sight of her and kissed her and given her the necklace of the goddess and all the rest. What did it mean? I went to sleep at last wondering what on earth it could mean, till presently that confounded clock woke me up again and I must go through the whole business once more. By degrees, this was towards dawn, I became aware that all hope of rest had vanished from me utterly, that I was most painfully awake and what is more, oppressed by a curious fear to the effect that something was going to happen to Miss Holmes. So vivid did this fear become that at length I arose, lit a candle and dressed myself. As it happened I knew where Miss Holmes slept. Her room, which I had seen her enter, was on the same corridor as mine, though at the other end of it, near the head of a stair that ran I knew not whither. In my portmanteau that had been sent over from Miss Manners' house, amongst other things was a small double-barrelled pistol, from which long habit I always carried with me loaded, except for the caps that were in a little leather case with some spare ammunition attached to the pistol belt. I took it out, capped it and thrust it into my pocket. Then I slipped from the room and stood behind a tall clock in the corridor, watching Miss Holmes' door and reflecting what a fool I should look if anyone chanced to find me. Half an hour or so later, by the light of the setting moon which struggled through a window, I saw the door open and Miss Holmes emerge in a kind of dressing gown and still wearing the necklace which Harût and Marût had given her. Of this I was sure, for the light gleamed upon the red stones. Also it shone upon her face and showed me without doubt that she was walking in her sleep. Gliding as silently as a ghost, she crossed the corridor and vanished. I followed and saw that she had descended an ancient twisting stairway which I had noted in the castle wall. I went after her, my stockinged feet making no noise, feeling my way carefully in the darkness of the stair, for I did not dare to strike a match. Beneath me I heard a noise as of someone fumbling with bolts. Then a door creaked on its hinges and there was some light. When I reached the doorway I caught sight of the figure of Miss Holmes flitting across a hollow garden that was laid out at the bottom of the castle moat, which had been drained. The garden, as I had observed when we walked through it on the previous day on our way to the first covert that we shot, was bordered by a shrubbery through which ran paths that led to the back drive of the castle. Across the garden glided the figure of Miss Holmes, and after it went I, crouching and taking cover behind every bush as though I were stalking big game, which indeed I was. She entered the shrubbery, moving much more swiftly now, for as she went she seemed to gather speed, like a stone which is rolled down a hill. It was as though whatever might be attracting her, for I felt sure that she was being drawn by something, acted more strongly upon her sleeping will as she drew nearer to it. For a while I lost sight of her in the shadow of the tall trees. Then suddenly I saw her again, standing quite still in an opening caused by the blowing down in the gale of one of the avenue of elms that bordered the back drive. But now she was no longer alone, for advancing towards her were two cloaked figures in whom I recognized Harût and Marût. There she stood with outstretched arms, and towards her, stealthily as lions stalking a buck, came Harût and Marût. Moreover, between the naked boughs of the fallen elm I caught sight of what looked like the outline of a closed carriage standing upon the drive. Also I heard a horse stamp upon the frosty ground. Round the edge of the little glade I ran, keeping in the dark shadow, as I went cocking the pistol that was in my pocket. Then suddenly I darted out and stood between Harût and Marût and Miss Holmes. Not a word passed between us. I think that all three of us subconsciously were anxious not to awake the sleeping woman, knowing that if we did so there would be a terrible scene. Only after motioning to me to stand aside, of course in vain, Harût and Marût drew from their robes curved and cruel-looking knives and bowed, for even now their politeness did not forsake them. I bowed back, and when I straightened myself those enterprising Easterns found that I was covering the heart of Harût with my pistol. Then, with that perception which is part of the mental outfit of the great, they saw that the game was up, since I could have shot them both before a knife touched me. "You have won this time, O Watcher by Night," whispered Harût softly, "but another time you will lose. That beautiful lady belongs to us and the people of the White Kender, for she is marked with the holy mark of the young moon. The call of the Child of Heaven is heard in her heart and will bring her home to the Child as it has brought her to us tonight. Now lead her hence still sleeping, O brave and clever one, so well named Watcher by Night." Then they were gone and presently I heard the sound of horses being driven rapidly along the drive. For a moment I hesitated as to whether I would or would not run in and shoot those horses. Two considerations stayed me. The first was that if I did so my pistol would be empty, or even if I shot one horse and retrained the barrel loaded with it, I could only kill a single man, leaving myself defenceless against the knife of the other. The second consideration was that now, as before, I did not wish to wake up Miss Holmes. I crept to her and, not knowing what else to do, took hold of one of her outstretched hands. She turned and came with me at once as though she knew me, remaining all the while fast asleep. Thus we went back to the house, through the still open door, up the stairway straight to her own room, on the threshold of which I loosed her hand. The room was dark and I could see nothing, but I listened until I heard a sound as of a person throwing herself upon the bed and drawing up the blankets. Then, knowing that she was safe for a while, I shut the door, which opened outwards as doors of ancient make sometimes do, and set against it a little table that stood in the passageway. Next, after reflecting for a minute, the circumstances being awkward in many ways, I went to my room and lit a candle. Obviously it was my duty to inform Lord Ragnall of what had happened and that as soon as possible, but I had no idea in what part of that huge building his sleeping place might be, nor, for patent reasons, was it desirable that I should disturb the house and so create talk. In this dilemma I remembered that Lord Ragnall's confidential servant, Mr. Savage, when he conducted me to my room on the previous night, which he made a point of doing perhaps because he wished to talk over the matter of the snakes that had found their way into his pockets, had shown me a bell in it which he said rang outside his door. He called it an emergency bell. I remarked idly that it was improbable that I should have any occasion for its use. "Who knows, sir?" said Mr. Savage prophetically. "There are folks who say that this old castle is haunted, which after what I have seen tonight I can well believe. If you should chance to meet a ghost looking, let us say, like those black villains, Harum and Scarum, or whatever they call themselves, well, sir, two's better company than one." I considered that bell, but was loath to ring it for the reasons I have given. Then I went outside the room and looked. As I had hoped might be the case, there ran the wire on the face of the wall connected along its length by other wires with the various rooms it passed. I set to work and followed that wire. It was not an easy job. Indeed, once or twice it reminded me of that story of the old Greek hero who found his way through a labyrinth by means of a silken thread. I forget whether it were a bull or a lady he was looking for, but with care and perseverance he found one or the other, or it may have been both. Down staircases and various passages I went with my eye glued upon the wire, which occasionally got mixed up with other wires, till at length it led me through a swing door covered with red baize into what appeared to be a modern annex to the castle. Here at last it terminated on the spring of an alarming looking and deep-throated bell which hung immediately over a certain door. On this door I knocked, hoping that it might be that of Mr. Savage and praying earnestly that it did not enclose the chaste resting place of the cook or any other female. Too late, I mean after I had knocked, it occurred to me that, if so, my position would be painful to a degree. However, in this particular fortune stood my friend, which does not always happen to the virtuous, for presently I heard a voice which I recognized as that of Mr. Savage, asking, not without a certain quaver in its tone, "Who the devil is that?" "Me," I replied, being flustered. "Me won't do," said the voice. "Me might be Harum, or it might be Scarum, or it might be someone worse. Who's me?" "Allan Quatermain, you idiot," I whispered through the keyhole. "Anna who? Well, never mind. Go away, Hannah. I'll talk to you in the morning." Then I kicked the door and at length very cautiously Mr. Savage opened it. "Good heavens, sir," he said, "what are you doing here, sir? Dressed too at this hour and with the handle of a pistol sticking out of your pocket. Or is it the head of a snake?" And he jumped back, a strange and stately figure in a long white nightshirt which apparently he wore over his underclothing. I entered the room and shut the door, whereon he politely handed me a chair, remarking: "Is it ghosts, sir, or are you ill? Or is it Harum and Scarum, of whom I have been thinking all night? Very cold too, sir, being afraid to pull up the bedclothes for fear lest there might be more reptiles in them." He pointed to his dress coat hanging on the back of another chair, with both pockets turned inside out, adding tragically, "To think, sir, that this new coat has been a nest of snakes, which I have hated like poison from a child, and me almost a teetotaler." "Yes," I said impatiently, "it's Harum and Scarum as you call them. Take me to Lord Ragnall's bedroom at once." "Ah, sir, burgling I suppose, or mayhap worse," he exclaimed as he threw on some miscellaneous garments and seized a life preserver which hung upon a hook. "Now I'm ready, only I hope they have left their snakes behind. I could never bear the sight of a snake, and they seem to know it, the brutes." In due course we reached Lord Ragnall's room, which Mr. Savage entered, and in answer to a stifled inquiry exclaimed, "Mr. Allan Quatermain to see you, my lord." "What is it, Quatermain?" he asked, sitting up in bed and yawning. "Have you had a nightmare?" "Yes," I answered, and Savage having left us and shut the door, I told him everything as it is written down. "Great heavens!" he exclaimed when I had finished. "If it had not been for you and your intuition and courage—" "Never mind me," I interrupted. "The question is, what should be done now? Are you going to try to arrest these men, or will you hold your tongue and merely cause them to be watched? Really, I don't know. Even if we catch them, the whole story would sound so strange in a law court, and all sorts of things might be suggested. Yes, Lord Ragnall, it would sound so strange that I beg you will come at once to see the evidences of what I tell you, before rain or snow obliterates them, bringing another witness with you. Lady Longden, perhaps. Lady Longden, one might as well write to the Times. I have it, there's Savage. He is faithful and can be silent." So Savage was called in and, while Lord Ragnall dressed himself hurriedly, told the outline of his story under pain of instant dismissal if he breathed a word. Really, to watch his face was as good as a play. So astonished was he that all he could ejaculate was, "The black-hearted villains! Well, they ain't friendly with snakes for nothing." Then, having made sure that Miss Holmes was still in her room, we went down the twisting stair and through the side doorway, locking the door after us. By now the dawn was breaking and there was enough light to enable me in certain places where the snow that fell after the gale remained, to show Lord Ragnall and Savage the impress of the little bedroom slippers which Miss Holmes wore, and of my stockinged feet following after. In the plantation things were still easier, for every detail of the movements of the four of us could be traced. Moreover, on the back drive was the spoor of the horses and the marks of the wheels of the carriage that had been brought for the purposes of the abduction. Also, my great good fortune, for this seemed to prove my theory, we found a parcel wrapped in native linen that appeared to have fallen out of the carriage when Harût and Marût made their hurried escape, as one of the wheels had gone over it. It contained an Eastern woman's dress and veil, intended, I suppose, to be used in disguising Miss Holmes, who thenceforward would have appeared to be the wife or daughter of one of the abductors. Savage discovered this parcel, which he lifted only to drop it with a yell, for underneath it lay a torpid snake, doubtless one of those that had been used in the performance. Of these discoveries and many other details, on our return to the house Lord Ragnall made full notes in a pocket book, that when completed were signed by all three of us. There is not much more to tell, that is, of this part of the story. The matter was put into the hands of detectives who discovered that the Easterns had driven to London, where all traces of the carriage which conveyed them was lost. They, however, embarked upon a steamer called the Antelope, together with two native women, who probably had been provided to look after Miss Holmes, and sailed that very afternoon for Egypt. Thither, of course, it was useless to follow them in those days, even if it had been advisable to do so. To return to Miss Holmes. She came down to breakfast looking very charming but rather pale. Again I sat next to her and took some opportunity to ask her how she had rested that night. She replied very well, and yet very ill, since, although she never remembered sleeping more soundly in her life, she had experienced all sorts of queer dreams of which she could remember nothing at all, a circumstance that annoyed her much, as she was sure that they were most interesting. Then she added, "Do you know, Mr. Quatermain, I found a lot of mud on my dressing gown this morning, and my bedroom slippers were also a mass of mud and wet through. How do you account for that? It is just as though I had been walking about outside in my sleep, which is absurd, as I never did such a thing in my life." Not feeling equal to the invention of any convincing explanation of these phenomena, I upset the marmalade pot onto the table in such a way that some of it fell upon her dress, and then covered my retreat with profuse apologies. Understanding my dilemma, for he had heard something of this talk, Lord Ragnall came to my aid with a startling statement of which I forget the purport, and thus the crisis passed. Shortly after breakfast Scroope announced to Miss Manners that her carriage was waiting, and we departed. Before I went, as it chanced, I had a few private words with my host, with Miss Holmes, and with the magnificent Mr. Savage. To the last, by the way, I offered a tip which he refused, saying that after all we had gone through together he would not allow money to come between us, by which he meant to pass from my pocket to his. Lord Ragnall asked me for both my English and my African addresses, which he noted in his pocket book. Then he said: "Really, Quatermain, I feel as though I had known you for years instead of 3 days. If you will allow me, I will add that I should like to know a great deal more of you." He was destined to do so, poor fellow, though neither of us knew it at the time. "If ever you come to England again, I hope you will make this house your headquarters." "And if ever you come to South Africa, Lord Ragnall, I hope you will make my 4-roomed shanty on the Berea at Durban your headquarters. You will get a hearty welcome there and something to eat, but little more." "There is nothing I should like better, Quatermain. Circumstances have put me in a certain position in this country. Still, to tell you the truth, there is a great deal about the life of which I grow very tired. But you see I am going to be married, and that I fear means an end of travelling, since naturally my wife will wish to take her place in society and the rest." "Of course," I replied, "for it is not every young lady who has the luck to become an English peeress with all the etceteras, is it? Still, I am not so sure but that Miss Holmes will take to travelling some day, although I am sure that she would do better to stay at home." He looked at me curiously, then asked: "You don't think there is anything really serious in all this business, do you?" "I don't know what to think," I answered, "except that you will do well to keep a good eye upon your wife. What those Easterns tried to do last night, and I think years ago, they may try again soon or years hence, for evidently they are patient and determined men with much to win. Also it is a curious coincidence that she should have that mark upon her which appeals so strongly to Messrs. Harût and Marût, and to be brief, she is in some ways different from most young women. As she said to me herself last night, Lord Ragnall, we are surrounded by mysteries, mysteries of blood, of inherited spirit, of this world generally, in which it is probable that we are all descended from quite a few common ancestors. And beyond these are other mysteries of the measureless universe to which we belong, that may already be exercising their strong and secret influences upon us, as perhaps, did we know it, they have done for millions of years in the infinite whence we came and whither we go." I suppose I spoke somewhat solemnly, for he said: "Do you know you frighten me a little, though I don't quite understand what you mean." Then we parted. With Miss Holmes my conversation was shorter. She remarked: "It has been a great pleasure to me to meet you. I do not remember anybody with whom I have found myself in so much sympathy, except one, of course. It is strange to think that when we meet again I shall be a married woman." "I do not suppose we shall ever meet again, Miss Holmes. Your life is here, mine is in the wildest places of a wild land far away." "Oh, yes, we shall," she answered. "I learned this and lots of other things when I held my head in that smoke last night." Then we also parted. Lastly Mr. Savage arrived with my coat. "Goodbye, Mr. Quatermain," he said. "If I forget everything else I shall never forget you and those villains, Harum and Scarum and their snakes. I hope it won't be my lot ever to clap eyes on them again, Mr. Quatermain, yet somehow I don't feel so sure of that." "Nor do I," I replied with a kind of inspiration, after which followed the episode of the rejected tip. End of chapter 5. Of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. The Bonafide Gold Mine. Fully 2 years had gone by since I bade farewell to Lord Ragnall and Miss Holmes, and when the curtain draws up again, behold me seated on the step of my little house at Durban, plunged in reflection and very sad indeed. Why I was sad I will explain presently. In that interval of time I had heard once or twice about Lord Ragnall. Thus I received from Scroope a letter telling of his lordship's marriage with Miss Holmes, which, it appeared, had been a very fine affair indeed, quite one of the events of the London season. 2 royalties attended the ceremony, a duke was the best man, and the presents, according to all accounts, were superb and of great value, including a priceless pearl necklace given by the bridegroom to the bride. A cutting from a society paper which Scroope enclosed dwelt at length upon the splendid appearance of the bridegroom and the sweet loveliness of the bride. Also it described her dress in language which was Greek to me. One sentence, however, interested me intensely. It ran: "The bride occasioned some comment by wearing only one ornament, although the Ragnall family diamonds, which have not seen the light for many years, are known to be some of the finest in the country. It was a necklace of what appeared to be large but rather roughly polished rubies, to which hung a small effigy of an Egyptian god also fashioned from a ruby. It must be added that although of unusual nature on such an occasion, this jewel suited her dark beauty well. Lady Ragnall's selection of it, however, from the many she possesses was the cause of much speculation. When asked by a friend why she had chosen it, she is reported to have said that it was to bring her good fortune." Now why did she wear the barbaric marriage gift of Harût and Marût in preference to all the other gems at her disposal? I wondered. The thing was so strange as to be almost uncanny. The second piece of information concerning this pair reached me through the medium of an old Times newspaper which I received over a year later. It was to the effect that a son and heir had been born to Lord Ragnall and that both mother and child were doing well. So there's the end to a very curious little story, thought I to myself. Well, during those 2 years many things befell me. First of all, in company with my old friend Sir Stephen Somers, I made the expedition to Pongoland in search of the wonderful orchid which he desired to add to his collection. I have already written of that journey and our extraordinary adventures, and need therefore allude to it no more here, except to say that during the course of it I was sorely tempted to travel to the territory north of the lake in which the Pongos dwelt. Much did I desire to see whether Messrs. Harût and Marût would in truth appear to conduct me to the land where the wonderful elephant, which was supposed to be animated by an evil spirit, was waiting to be killed by my rifle. However, I resisted the impulse, as indeed our circumstances obliged me to do. In the end we returned safely to Durban, and here I came to the conclusion that never again would I risk my life on such mad expeditions. Owing to circumstances which I have detailed elsewhere, I was now in possession of a considerable sum of cash, and this I determined to lay out in such a fashion as to make me independent of hunting and trading in the wilder regions of Africa. As usual, when money is forthcoming, an opportunity soon presented itself in the shape of a gold mine, which had been discovered on the borders of Zululand, one of the first that was ever found in those districts. A Jew trader named Jacob brought it to my notice and offered me a half share if I would put up the capital necessary to work the mine. I made a journey of inspection and convinced myself that it was indeed a wonderful proposition. I need not enter into the particulars, nor, to tell the truth, have I any desire to do so, for the subject is still painful to me, further than to say that this Jew and some friends of his panned out visible gold before my eyes and then revealed to me the magnificent quartz reef from which, as they demonstrated, it had been washed in the bygone ages of the world. The news of our discovery spread like wildfire, and as, whatever else I might be, everyone knew that I was honest, in the end a small company was formed with Allan Quatermain, Esquire, as the chairman of the Bona Fide Gold Mine Limited. Oh, that company! Often to this day I dream of it when I have indigestion. Our capital was small, £10,000, of which the Jew, who was well named Jacob, and his friends, took half, for nothing of course, as the purchase price of their rights. I thought the proportion large and said so, especially after I had ascertained that these rights had cost them exactly 3 dozen of square-faced gin, a broken-down wagon, 4 cows past the bearing age and £5 in cash. However, when it was pointed out to me that by their peculiar knowledge and genius they had located and provided the value of a property of enormous potential worth, moreover that this sum was to be paid to them in scrip, which would only be realizable when success was assured and not in money, After a night of anxious consideration I gave way. Personally, before I consented to accept the chairmanship, which carried with it a salary of £100 a year, which I never got, I bought and paid for in cash shares to the value of £1,000 sterling. I remember that Jacob and his friends seemed surprised at this act of mine, as they had offered to give me 500 of their shares for nothing, in consideration of the guarantee of my name. These I refused, saying that I would not ask others to invest in a venture in which I had no actual money stake, whereon they accepted my decision, not without enthusiasm. In the end the balance of £4,000 was subscribed and we got to work. Work is a good name for it, so far as I was concerned, for never in all my days have I gone through so harrowing a time. We began by washing a certain patch of gravel and obtained results which seemed really astonishing. So remarkable were they that on publication the shares rose to 10 shillings premium. Jacob and Co. took advantage of this opportunity to sell quite half of their bonus holding to eager applicants, explaining to me that they did so not for personal profit, which they scorned, but to broaden the basis of the undertaking by admitting fresh blood. It was shortly after this boom that the gravel surrounding the rich patch became very gravelly indeed, and it was determined that we should buy a small battery and begin to crush the quartz from which the gold was supposed to flow in a Pactolian stream. We negotiated for that battery through a Cape Town firm of engineers, but why follow the melancholy business in all its details? The shares began to decrease in value. They shrank to their original price of £1, then to 15 shillings, then to 10 shillings. Jacob, he was managing director, explained to me that it was necessary to support the market, as he was already doing to an enormous extent, and that I as chairman ought to take a lead in this good work in order to show my faith in the concern. I took a lead to the extent of another £500, which was all that I could afford. I admit that it was a shock to such trust in human nature as remained to me, when I discovered subsequently that the 1,000 shares which I bought for my £500 had really been the property of Jacob, although they appeared to be sold to me in various other names. The crisis came at last, for before that battery was delivered our available funds were exhausted, and no one would subscribe another halfpenny. Debentures, it is true, had been issued and taken up to the extent of about £1,000 out of the £5,000 offered, though who bought them remained at the time a mystery to me. Ultimately a meeting was called to consider the question of liquidating the company, and at this meeting, after 3 sleepless nights, I occupied the chair. When I entered the room, to my amazement, I found that of the 5 directors only one was present besides myself, an honest old retired sea captain who had bought and paid for 300 shares. Jacob and the 2 friends who represented his interests had, it appeared, taken ship that morning for Cape Town, whither they were summoned to attend various relatives who had been seized with illness. It was a stormy meeting at first. I explained the position to the best of my ability, and when I had finished was assailed with a number of questions which I could not answer to the satisfaction of myself or of anybody else. Then a gentleman, the owner of 10 shares, who had evidently been drinking, suggested in plain language that I had cheated the shareholders by issuing false reports. I jumped up in a fury and, although he was twice my size, asked him to come and argue the question outside, whereon he promptly went away. This incident excited a laugh, and then the whole truth came out. A man with coloured blood in him stood up and told a story which was subsequently proved to be true. Jacob had employed him to salt the mine by mixing a heavy sprinkling of gold in the gravel we had first washed, which the coloured man swore he did in innocence, and subsequently had defrauded him of his wages. That was all. I sank back in my chair overcome. Then some good fellow in the audience, who had lost money himself in the affair, and whom I scarcely knew, got up and made a noble speech which went far to restore my belief in human nature. He said in effect that it was well known that I, Allan Quatermain, after working like a horse in the interests of the shareholders, had practically ruined myself over this enterprise, and that the real thief was Jacob, who had made tracks for the Cape, taking with him a large cash profit resulting from the sale of shares. Finally he concluded by calling for 3 cheers for our honest friend and fellow sufferer, Mr. Allan Quatermain. Strange to say, the audience gave them very heartily indeed. I thanked them with tears in my eyes, saying that I was glad to leave the room as poor as I had ever been, but with a reputation which my conscience as well as their kindness assured me was quite unblemished. Thus the winding up resolution was passed and that meeting came to an end. After shaking hands with my deliverer from a most unpleasant situation, I walked homewards with the lightest heart in the world. My money was gone, it was true. Also my overconfidence in others had led me to make a fool of myself by accepting as fact, on what I believed to be the evidence of my eyes, that which I had not sufficient expert knowledge to verify. But my honour was saved, and as I have again and again seen in the course of life, money is nothing when compared with honour, a remark which Shakespeare made long ago, though like many other truths this is one of which a full appreciation can only be gained by personal experience. Not very far from the place where our meeting had been held, I passed a side street then in embryo, for it had only 1 or 2 houses situated in their gardens, and a rather large and muddy sluit of water running down one side at the edge of the footpath. Save for 2 people this street was empty, but that pair attracted my attention. They were a white man in whom I recognized the stout and half intoxicated individual who had accused me of cheating the company and then departed, and a withered old Hottentot who at that distance, nearly 100 yards away, much reminded me of a certain Hans. This Hans, I must explain, was originally a servant of my father, who was a missionary in the Cape Colony, and had been my companion in many adventures. Thus in my youth he and I alone escaped when Dingaan murdered Retief and his party of Boers. See the book called Marie, editor. And he had been one of my party in our quest for the wonderful orchid, the record of which I have written down in The Holy Flower. Hans had his weak points, among which must be counted his love of liquor, but he was a gallant and resourceful old fellow, as indeed he had amply proved upon that orchid-seeking expedition. Moreover, he loved me with a love passing the love of women. Now, having acquired some money in a way I need not stop to describe, for is it not written elsewhere, he was settled as a kind of little chief on a farm not very far from Durban, where he lived in great honour because of the fame of his deeds. The white man and Hans, if Hans it was, were engaged in a violent altercation whereof snatches floated to me on the breeze spoken in the Dutch language. "You dirty little Hottentot!" shouted the white man, waving a stick. "I'll cut the liver out of you. What do you mean by nosing after me like a jackal?" And he struck at Hans, who jumped aside. "Son of a white fat sow!" screamed Hans in answer, for the moment I heard his voice I knew that it was Hans. "How dare you to call the Baas a thief? Yes, a thief, O rooter in the mud, O feeder on filth and worms, O hog of the gutter, the Baas, the clipping of whose nail is worth more than you and all your family. He whose honour is as clear as the sunlight and whose heart is cleaner than the white sand of the sea." "Yes, I did," roared the white man, "for he got my money in that gold mine." "Then, hog, why did you run away? Why did you not wait to tell him so outside that house?" "I'll teach you about running away, you little yellow dog," replied the other, catching Hans a cut across the ribs. "Oh, you want to see me run, do you?" said Hans, skipping back a few yards with a wonderful agility. "Then look." Thus speaking, he lowered his head and charged like a buffalo. Fair in the middle he caught that white man, causing him to double up, fly backwards and land with a most resounding splash in the deepest part of the muddy sluit. Here I may remark that, as his shins are the weakest, a Hottentot's head is by far the hardest and most dangerous part of him. Indeed, it seems to partake the nature of a cannon ball, for, without more than a temporary disturbance to its possessor, I have seen a half-loaded wagon go over one of them on a muddy road. Having delivered this thrust home, Hans bolted round a corner and disappeared, while I waited trembling to see what happened to his adversary. To my relief, nearly a minute later he crept out of the sluit covered with mud and dripping with water, and hobbled off slowly down the street, his head so near his feet that he looked as though he had been folded in two, and his hands pressed upon what I believe is medically known as the diaphragm. Then I also went upon my way roaring with laughter. Often I have heard Hottentots called the lowest of mankind, but, reflected I, they can at any rate be good friends to those who treat them well, a fact of which I was to have further proof ere long. By the time I reached my house and had filled my pipe and sat myself down on the dilapidated cane chair on the veranda, that natural reaction set in which so often follows rejoicing at the escape from some great danger. It was true that no one believed I had cheated them over that thrice accursed gold mine, but how about other matters? I mused upon the Bible narrative of Jacob and Esau with a new and very poignant sympathy for Esau. I wondered what would become of my Jacob. Jacob, I mean the original, prospered exceedingly as a result of his deal in porridge, and, as thought I, probably would his artful descendant who so appropriately bore his name. As a matter of fact, I do not know what became of him, but bearing his talents in mind, I think it probable that, like Van Koop, under some other patronymic he has now been rewarded with a title by the British Government. At any rate, I had eaten the porridge in the shape of worthless but dearly purchased shares, after labouring hard in the chase of the golden calf, while brother Jacob had got my inheritance, or rather my money. Probably he was now counting it over in sovereigns upon the ship, and sniggering as he thought of the shareholders' meeting with me in the chair. Well, he was a thief, and would run his road to whatever end is appointed for thieves, so why should I bother my head more about him? As I had kept my honour, let him take my savings. But I had a son to support, and now what was I to do with scarcely £300, a good stock of guns and this little Durban property left to me in the world? Commerce in all its shapes I renounced once and for ever. It was too high or too low for me, so it would seem that there remained to me only my old business of professional hunting. Once again I must seek those adventures which I had forsworn when my evil star shone so brightly over a gold mine. What was it to be? Elephants, I supposed, since these are the only creatures worth killing from a money point of view. But most of my old haunts had been more or less shot out. The competition of younger professionals, of wandering black-velled Boers, and even of poaching natives who had obtained guns, was growing severe. If I went at all I should have to travel further afield. Whilst I meditated thus, turning over the comparative advantages or disadvantages of various possible hunting grounds in my mind, my attention was caught by a kind of cough that seemed to proceed from the farther side of a large gardenia bush. It was not a human cough, but rather resembled that made by a certain small buck at night, probably to signal to its mate, which of course it could not be as there were no buck within several miles. Yet I knew it came from a human throat, for had I not heard it before in many an hour of difficulty and danger? "Draw near, Hans," I said in Dutch, and instantly out of a clump of aloes that grew in front of the pomegranate hedge crept the withered shape of the old Hottentot, as a big yellow snake might do. Why he should choose this method of advance instead of that offered by the garden path I did not know, but it was quite in accordance with his secretive nature, inherited from 100 generations of ancestors who spent their lives avoiding the observance of murderous foes. He squatted down in front of me, staring in a vacant way at the fierce ball of the westering sun without blinking an eyelid, just as a vulture does. "You look to me as though you had been fighting, Hans," I said. "The crown of your hat is knocked out, you are splashed with mud, and there is the mark of a stick upon your left side." "Yes, Baas, you are right as usual, Baas. I had a quarrel with a man about sixpence that he owed me, and knocked him over with my head, forgetting to take my hat off first. Therefore it is spoiled, for which I am sorry, as it was quite a new hat, not 2 years old. The Baas gave it me." He bought it in a store in Utrecht when we were coming back from Pongoland." "Why do you lie to me?" I asked. "You have been fighting a white man and for more than sixpence. You knocked him into a sluit and the mud splashed up over you." "Yes, Baas, that is so. Your spirit speaks truly to you of the matter. Yet it wanders a little from the path, since I fought the white man for less than sixpence. I fought him for love, which is nothing at all." "Then you are an even bigger fool than I took you for, Hans. What do you want now?" "I want to borrow £1, Baas. The white man will take me before the magistrate and I shall be fined £1 or 14 days in the trunk, i.e. jail. It is true that the white man struck me first, but the magistrate will not believe the word of a poor old Hottentot against his, and I have no witness. He will say, 'Hans, you were drunk again. Hans, you are a liar and deserve to be flogged, which you will be next time. Pay £1 and 10 shillings more, which is the price of good white justice, or go to the trunk for 14 days and make baskets there for the great Queen to use.' Baas, I have the price of the justice, which is 10 shillings, but I want to borrow the £1 for the fine." "Hans, I think that just now you are better able to lend me £1 than I am to lend one to you. My bag is empty, Hans." "Is it so, Baas? Well, it does not matter. If necessary I can make baskets for the great white queen to put her food in for 14 days, or mats on which she will wipe her feet. The trunk is not such a bad place, Baas. It gives me time to think of the white man's justice and to thank the Great One in the sky, because the little sins one did not do have been found out and punished, while the big sins one did do, such as—well, never mind, Baas, have not been found out at all. Your reverend father, the predicant, always taught me to have a thankful heart, Baas, and when I remember that I have only been in the trunk for 3 months altogether who, if all were known, ought to have been there for years, I remember his words, Baas." "Why should you go to the trunk at all, Hans, when you are rich and can pay a fine even if it were £100? "A month or two ago it is true I was rich, Baas, but now I am poor. I have nothing left except 10 shillings. "Hans," I said severely, "you have been gambling again. You have been drinking again. You have sold your property and your cattle to pay your gambling debts and to buy square face gin." "Yes, Baas, and for no good it seems, though it is not true that I have been drinking. I sold the land and the cattle for £650, Baas, and with the money I bought other things." "What did you buy?" I said. He fumbled first in one pocket of his coat and then in the other, and ultimately produced a crumpled and dirty looking piece of paper that resembled a banknote. I took it and examined this document, and the next minute nearly fainted. It certified that Hans was the proprietor of I know not how many debentures or shares, I forget which they were, in the Bona Fide Gold Mine Limited, that same company of which I was the unlucky chairman, in consideration for which he had paid a sum of over £650. "Hans," I said feebly, "from whom did you buy this?" "From the Baas with the hooked nose, Baas. He who was named Jacob after the great man in the Bible of whom your father the predicant used to tell us, the one who was so slim and dressed himself up in a goatskin and gave his brother mealie porridge when he was hungry, after he had come in from shooting buck, Baas, and got his farm and cattle, Baas, and then went to heaven up a ladder, Baas." "And who told you to buy them, Hans?" "Sammy, Baas, he who was your cook when we went to Pongoland, he who hid in the mealie pit when the slavers burned Beza Town, and came out half cooked like a fowl from the oven. The Baas Jacob stopped at Sammy's hotel, Baas, and told him that unless he bought bits of paper like this, of which he had plenty, you would be brought before the magistrate and sent to the trunk, Baas. So Sammy bought some, Baas, but not many, for he had only a little money, and the Baas Jacob paid him for all he ate and drank with other bits of paper. Then Sammy came to me and showed me what it was my duty to do, reminding me that your reverend father the predicant had left you in my charge till one of us dies, whether you were well or ill and whether you got better or got worse, just like a white wife, Baas. So I sold the farm and the cattle to a friend of the Baas Jacob's at a very low price, Baas, and that is all the story." I heard and, to tell the honest truth, I almost wept, since the thought of the sacrifice which this poor old Hottentot had made for my sake on the instigation of a rogue utterly overwhelmed me. "Hans," I asked, recovering myself, "tell me what was that new name which the Zulu captain Mavovo gave you before he died? I mean after you had fired Beza Town and caught Hassan and his slavers in their own trap." Hans, who had suddenly found something that interested him extremely out at sea, perhaps because he did not wish to witness my grief, turned round slowly and answered: "Mavovo named me Light in Darkness, and by that name the Kaffirs know me now, Baas, though some of them call me Lord of the Fire." "Then Mavovo named you well, for indeed, Hans, you shine like a light in the darkness of my heart. I whom you think wise am but a fool, Hans, who has been tricked by a verneuker, a common cheat, and he has tricked you and Sammy as well. But as he has shown me that man can be very vile, you have shown me that he can be very noble, and setting the one against the other, my spirit that was in the dust rises up once more like a withered flower after rain. Light in darkness, although if I had £10,000 I could never pay you back, since what you have given me is more than all the gold in the world and all the land and all the cattle. Yet with honour and with love I will try to pay you," and I held out my hand to him. He took it and pressed it against his wrinkled old forehead, then answered: "Talk no more of that, Baas, for it makes me sad, who am so happy. How often have you forgiven me when I have done wrong? How often have you not flogged me when I should have been flogged for being drunk and other things? Yes, even when once I stole some of your powder and sold it to buy square-face gin, though it is true I knew it was bad powder not fit for you to use. Did I thank you then overmuch? Why therefore should you thank me who have done but a little thing, not really to help you but because, as you know, I love gambling and was told that this bit of paper would soon be worth much more than I gave for it. If it had proved so, should I have given you that money? No, I should have kept it myself and bought a bigger farm and more cattle." "Hans," I said sternly, "if you lie so hard you will certainly go to hell, as the predicant my father often told you." "Not if I lie for you, Baas, or if I do it doesn't matter, except that then we should be separated by the big kloof written of in the book, especially as there I should meet the Baas Jacob, as I very much want to do for a reason of my own." Not wishing to pursue this somewhat unchristian line of thought, I inquired of him why he felt happy. "Oh, Baas," he answered with a twinkle in his little black eyes, "can't you guess why? Now you have very little money left and I have none at all. Therefore it is plain that we must go somewhere to earn money, and I am glad of that, Baas, for I am tired of sitting on that farm out there and growing mealies and milking cows, especially as I am too old to marry, Baas, and you are tired of looking for gold when there isn't any and singing sad songs in that house of meeting yonder like you did this afternoon. Oh, the Great Father in the skies knew what he was about when he sent the Baas Jacob our way. He beat us for our own good, Baas. He does always, if we could only understand." I reflected to myself that I had not often heard the doctrine of the Church better or more concisely put, but I only said: "That is true, Hans, and I thank you for the lesson, the second you have taught me today. But where are we to go, Hans? Remember, it must be elephants." He suggested some places, indeed he seemed to have come provided with a list of them, and I sat silent, making no comment. At length he finished and squatted there before me, chewing a bit of tobacco I had given him and looking up at me interrogatively with his head on one side, for all the world like a dilapidated and inquisitive bird. "Hans," I said, "do you remember a story I told you when you came to see me a year or more ago, about a tribe called the Kender in whose country there is said to be a great cemetery of elephants which travel there to die from all the land about, a country that lies somewhere to the northeast of the lake island on which the Pongo used to dwell?" "Yes, Baas." "And you said, I think, that you had never heard of such a people." "No, Baas, I never said anything at all. I have heard a good deal about them." "Then why did you not tell me before, you little idiot?" I asked indignantly. "What was the good, Baas? You were hunting gold then, not ivory. Why should I make you unhappy and waste my own breath by talking about beautiful things which were far beyond the reach of either of us, far as that sky?" "Don't ask fool's questions, but tell me what you know, Hans. Tell me at once." "This, Baas. When we were up at Beza Town after we came back from killing the gorilla god, and the Baas Stephen, your friend, lay sick, there was nothing else to do. I talked with everyone I could find worth talking to, and they were not many, Baas. But there was one very old woman who was not of the Mazitu race and whose husband and children were all dead, but whom the people in the town looked up to and feared because she was wise and made medicines out of herbs and told fortunes. I used to go to see her. She was quite blind, Baas, and fond of talking with me, which shows how wise she was. I told her all about the Pongo gorilla god, of which already she knew something. When I had done, she said that he was as nothing compared with a certain god that she had seen in her youth, 7 tens of years ago, when she became marriageable. I asked her for that story, and she spoke it thus: "Far away to the north and east live a people called the Kender, who are ruled over by a sultan. They are a very great people and inhabit a most fertile country. But all round their country the land is desolate and manless, peopled only by game, for the reason that they will suffer none to dwell there. That is why nobody knows anything of them. He that comes across the wilderness into that land is killed and never returns to tell of it." She told me also that she was born of this people but fled because their sultan wished to place her in his house of women, which she did not desire. For a long while she wandered southwards, living on roots and berries, till she came to desert land and at last, worn out, lay down to die. Then she was found by some of the Mazitu who were on an expedition seeking ostrich feathers for war plumes. They gave her food and, seeing that she was fair, brought her back to their country, where one of them married her. But of her own land she uttered only lying words to them because she feared that if she told the truth the gods who guard its secrets would be avenged upon her, though now when she was near to death she dreaded them no more, since even the Kender gods cannot swim through the waters of death. That is all she said about her journey because she had forgotten the rest." "Bother her journey, Hans. What did she say about her god and the Kender people?" "This, Baas, that the Kendah have not one god, but two, and not one ruler, but two. They have a good god who is a child fetish," here I started, "that speaks through the mouth of an oracle who is always a woman. If that woman dies, the god does not speak until they find another woman bearing certain marks which show that she holds the spirit of the god. Before the woman dies, she always tells the priests in what land they are to look for her who is to come after her. But sometimes they cannot find her, and then trouble falls because the child has lost its tongue, and the people become the prey of the other god that never dies." "And what is that god, Hans?" "That god, Baas, is an elephant." Here I started again. "A very bad elephant to which human sacrifice is offered. I think, Baas, that it is the devil wearing the shape of an elephant. At least that is what she said. Now the sultan is a worshipper of the god that dwells in the elephant Jana." Here I positively whistled. "And so are most of the people, indeed all those among them who are black. For once far away in the beginning of Kendah were two peoples, but the lighter coloured people who worshipped the Child came down from the north and conquered the black people, bringing the Child with them, or so I understood her, Baas, thousands and thousands of years ago when the world was young. Since then they have flowed on side by side like two streams in the same channel, never mixing, for each keeps its own colour. Only, she said, that stream which comes from the north grows weaker and that from the south more strong. Then why does not the strong swallow up the weak? Because the weak are still the pure and the wise, Baas, or so the old vrouw declared. Because they worship the good while the others worship the devil, and as your father the predicant used to say, good is the cock which always wins the fight at last, Baas. Yes, when he seems to be dead he gets up again and kicks the devil in the stomach and stands on him and crows, Baas. Also these northern folk are mighty magicians. Through their child fetish they give rain and fat seasons and keep away sickness, whereas Jana gives only evil gifts that have to do with cruelty and war and so forth. Lastly, the priests who rule the Child have the secrets of wealth and ancient knowledge, whereas the Sultan and his followers have only the might of the spear. This was the song which the old woman sang to me, Baas. Why did you not tell me of these matters when we were at Beza Town and I could have talked with her myself, Hans? For two reasons, Baas. The first was that I feared, if I told you, you would wish to go on to find these people, whereas I was tired of travelling and wanted to come to Natal to rest. The second was that on the night when the old woman finished telling me her story, she was taken sick and died, and therefore it would have been no use to bring you to see her. So I saved it up in my head until it was wanted. Moreover, Baas, all the Mazitu declared that old woman to be the greatest of liars. She was not altogether a liar, Hans. Hear what I have learned. And I told him of the magic of Harût and Marût, and of the picture that I seemed to see of the elephant Jana, and of the prayer that Harût and Marût had made to me, to all of which he listened quite stolidly. It is not easy to astonish a Hottentot's brain, which often draws no accurate dividing line between the possible and what the modern world holds to be impossible. "Yes, Baas," he said when I had finished, "then it seems that the old woman was not such a liar after all. Baas, when shall we start after that hoard of dead ivory, and which way will you go? By Kilwa or through Zululand? It should be settled soon because of the seasons." After this we talked together for a long while, for with pockets as empty as mine were then, the problem seemed difficult if not insoluble. End of chapter 6. Of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Lord Ragnall's Story. That night Hans slept at my house, or rather outside of it in the garden, or upon the step, saying that he feared arrest if he went to the town because of his quarrel with the white man. As it happened, however, the other party concerned never stirred further in the business, probably because he was too drunk to remember who had knocked him into the sluit, or whether he had gravitated thither by accident. On the following morning we renewed our discussion, debating in detail every possible method of reaching the Kender people by help of such means as we could command. Like that of the previous night, it proved somewhat abortive. Obviously such a long and hazardous expedition ought to be properly financed, and where was the money? At length I came to the conclusion that if we went at all it would be best in the circumstances for Hans and myself to start alone with a Scotch cart drawn by oxen and driven by a couple of Zulu hunters, which we would lade with ammunition and a few necessaries. Thus lightly equipped we might work through Zululand and thence northward to Beza Town, the capital of the Mazitu, where we were sure welcome. After that we must take our chance. It was probable that we should never reach the district where these Kender were supposed to dwell, but at least I might be able to kill some elephants in the wild country beyond Zululand. While we were talking I heard a gun fired which announced the arrival of the English mail, and stepping to the end of the garden saw the steamer lying at anchor outside the bar. Then I went indoors to write a few business letters which, since I had become immersed in the affairs of that unlucky gold mine, had grown to be almost a daily task with me. I had got through several with many groanings, for none were agreeable in their tenor, when Hans poked his head through the window in a silent kind of way as a big snake might do, and said, "Baas, I think there are two bosses out on the road there who are looking for you. Very fine bosses whom I don't know. Shareholders in the bona fide gold mine," I thought to myself, then added as I prepared to leave through the back door, "If they come here, tell them I am not at home. Tell them I left early this morning for the Congo River to look for the sources of the Nile." "Yes, Baas," said Hans, collapsing onto the step. I went out through the back door, sorrowing that I, Allan Quatermain, should have reached a rung in the ladder of life whence I shrank from looking any stranger in the face for fear of what he might have to say to me. Then suddenly my pride asserted itself. After all, what was there of which I should be ashamed? I would face these irate shareholders as I had faced the others yesterday. I walked round the little house to the front garden which was planted with orange trees, and up to a big moonflower bush, I believe datura is its right name, that grew near the pomegranate hedge which separated my domain from the road. Therein a conversation was in progress, if so it may be called. "Ikona," that is, I don't know. "Inkosi," i.e. chief, said some Kaffir in a stupid drawl. Thereon a voice that instantly struck me as familiar answered, "We want to know where the great hunter lives." "Ikona," said the Kaffir. "Can't you remember his native name?" asked another voice which was also familiar to me, for I never forgot voices, though I am unable to place them at once. "The great hunter, here come a Zani," said the first voice triumphantly, and instantly there flashed back upon my mind a vision of the splendid drawing room at Ragnall Castle and of an imposing majordomo introducing into it two white-robed Arab-looking men. "Mr. Savage, by the heavens!" I muttered. "What in the name of goodness is he doing here?" "There," said the second voice, "your black friend has bolted, and no wonder, for who can be called by such a name? If you had done what I told you, Savage, and hired a white guide, it would have saved us a lot of trouble. Why will you always think that you know better than anyone else?" "Seemed an unnecessary expense, my lord, considering we are travelling incog, my lord." "How long shall we travel incog if you persist in calling me my lord at the top of your voice, Savage? There is a house beyond those trees. Go in and ask where—" By this time I had reached the gate, which I opened, remarking quietly, "How do you do, Lord Ragnall? How do you do, Mr. Savage? I thought that I recognized your voices on the road and came to see if I was right. Please walk in, that is, if it is I whom you wish to visit." As I spoke I studied them both and observed that while Savage looked much the same, although slightly out of place in these strange surroundings, the time that had passed since we met had changed Lord Ragnall a good deal. He was still a magnificent looking man, one of those whom no one that had seen him would ever forget, but now his handsome face was stamped with some new seal of suffering. I felt at once that he had become acquainted with grief. The shadow in his dark eyes and a certain worn expression about the mouth told me that this was so. "Yes, Quatermain," he said as he took my hand, "it is you whom I have travelled 7,000 miles to visit, and I thank God that I have been so fortunate as to find you. I feared lest you might be dead or perhaps far away in the centre of Africa where I should never be able to track you down." "A week later perhaps you would not have found me, Lord Ragnall," I answered, "but as it happens misfortune has kept me here." "And misfortune has brought me here, Quatermain." Then before I had time to answer Savage came up and we went into the house. "You are just in time for lunch," I said, "and as luck will have it there is a good rock cod and a leg of Aribe buck for you to eat. Boy, set two more places." "One more place, if you please, sir," said Mr. Savage. "I should prefer to take my food afterwards." "You will have to get over that in Africa," I muttered. Still I let him have his way, with the result that presently the strange sight was seen of the magnificent English majordomo standing behind my chair in the little room and handing round the square face as though it were champagne. It was a spectacle that excited the greatest interest in my primitive establishment and caused Hans, with some native hangers-on, to gather at the window. However, Lord Ragnall took it as a matter of course and I thought it better not to interfere. When we had finished we went on to the step to smoke, leaving Savage to eat his dinner, and I asked Lord Ragnall where his luggage was. He replied that he had left it at the customs. "Then," I said, "we will send a native with Savage to arrange about getting it up here. If you do not mind my rough accommodation, there is room for you and your man can pitch a tent in the garden." After some demur he accepted with gratitude, and a little later Savage and the native were sent off with a note to a man who hired out a mule cart. "Now," I said, when the gate had shut behind them, "will you tell me why you have come to Africa?" "Disaster," he replied, "disaster of the worst sort." "Is your wife dead, Lord Ragnall?" "I do not know. I almost hope that she is. At any rate, she is lost to me." An idea leapt to my mind to the effect that she might have run away with somebody else, a thing which often happens in the world, but fortunately I kept it to myself and only said: "She was nearly lost once before, was she not?" "Yes, when you saved her. Oh, if only you had been with us, Quatermain, this would never have happened. Listen. About 18 months ago she had a son, a very beautiful child. She recovered well from the business and we were as happy as two mortals could be, for we loved each other, Quatermain, and God has blessed us in every way. We were so happy that I remember her telling me that our great good fortune made her feel afraid. One day last September when I was out shooting, she drove in a little pony cart we had with the nurse and the child but no man, to call on Mrs. Scroope, who also has been recently confined. She often went out thus, for the pony was an old animal and quiet as a sheep. By some cursed trick of fate it chanced that they were passing through a little town which you may remember near Ragnall. They met a travelling menagerie that was going to some new encampment. At the head of the procession marched a large bull elephant, which I discovered afterwards was an ill-tempered brute that had already killed a man and should never have been allowed upon the roads. The sight of the pony cart, or perhaps a red cloak which my wife was wearing, as she always liked bright colours, for some unknown reason seems to have infuriated this beast, which trumpeted. The pony, becoming frightened, wheeled round and overturned the cart right in front of the animal, but apparently without hurting anybody. Then—" here he paused a moment and with an effort continued, "that devil in beast's shape cocked its ears, stretched out its long trunk, dragged the baby from the nurse's arms, whirled it round and threw it high into the air, to fall crushed upon the curb. It sniffed at the body of the child, feeling it over with the tip of its trunk as though to make sure that it was dead. Next, once more it trumpeted triumphantly and without attempting to harm my wife or anybody else, walked quietly past the broken cart and continued its journey until outside the town was made fast and shot." "What an awful story!" I said with a gasp. "Yes, but there is worse to follow. My poor wife went off her head with the shock, I suppose, for no physical injury could be found upon her. She did not suffer in health or become violent, quite the reverse indeed, for her gentleness increased. She just went off her head. For hours at a time she would sit silent and smiling, playing with the stones of that red necklace which those conjurers gave her, or rather counting them, as a nun might do the beads of her rosary. At times, however, she would talk, but always to the baby, as though it lay before her or she was nursing it. Oh, Quatermain, it was pitiful, pitiful. I did everything I could. She was seen by 3 of the greatest brain doctors in England, but none of them was able to help. The only hope they gave was that the fit might pass off as suddenly as it had come. They said, too, that a thorough change of scene would perhaps be beneficial, and suggested Egypt. That was in October. I did not take much to the idea, I don't know why, and personally should not have acceded to it had it not been for a curious circumstance. The last consultation took place in the big drawing room at Ragnall. When it was over my wife remained with her mother at one end of the room, while I and the doctors talked together at the other, as I thought quite out of her earshot. Presently, however, she called to me, saying in a perfectly clear and natural voice, "Yes, George, I will go to Egypt. I should like to go to Egypt." Then she went on playing with the necklace and talking to the imaginary child. Again on the following morning, as I came into her room to kiss her, she exclaimed, "When do we start for Egypt? Let it be soon." With these sayings the doctors were very pleased, declaring that they showed signs of a returning interest in life and begging me not to thwart her wish. So I gave way, and in the end we went to Egypt together with Lady Longden, who insisted upon accompanying us, although she is a wretched sailor. At Cairo a large dahabeeyah that I had hired in advance, manned by an excellent crew and a guard of 4 soldiers, was awaiting us. In it we started up the Nile. For a month or more all went well. Also to my delight my wife seemed now and again to show signs of returning intelligence. Thus she took some interest in the sculptures on the walls of the temples, about which she had been very fond of reading when in health. I remember that only a few days before the catastrophe, she pointed out one of them to me. It was of Isis and the infant Horus, saying, "Look, George, the Holy Mother and the Holy Child," and then bowed to it reverently as she might have done to an altar. At length, after passing the first cataract and the Isle of the Philau, we came to the temple of Abu Simbel, opposite to which our boat was moored. On the following morning we explored the temple at daybreak and saw the sun strike upon the 4 statues which sit at its farther end, spending the rest of that day studying the colossal figures of Rameses that are carved upon its face and watching some cavalcades of Arabs mounted upon camels travelling along the banks of the Nile. My wife was unusually quiet that afternoon. For hour after hour she sat still upon the deck, gazing first at the mouth of the rock-hewn temple and the mighty figures which guard it, and then at the surrounding desert. Only once did I hear her speak, and then she said, "Beautiful, beautiful. Now I am at home." We dined, and as there was no moon, went to bed rather early after listening to the Sudanese singers as they sang one of their weird chanties. My wife and her mother slept together in the state cabin of the dahabeeyah, which was at the stern of the boat. My cabin, a small one, was on one side of this, and that of the trained nurse on the other. The crew and the guard were forward of the saloon. A gangway was fixed from the side to the shore, and over it a sentry stood, or was supposed to stand. During the night a calmsyned wind began to blow, though lightly as was to be expected at this season of the year. I did not hear it for, as a matter of fact, I slept very soundly, as it appears did everyone else upon the dahabeeyah, including the sentry, as I suspect. The first thing I remember was the appearance of Lady Longden just at daybreak at the doorway of my cabin and the frightened sound of her voice asking if Luna, that is my wife, was with me. Then it transpired that she had left her cabin clad in a fur cloak, evidently some time before, as the bed in which she had been lying was quite cold. Quatermain, we searched everywhere. We searched for 4 days, and from that hour to this no trace of her has been found. "Have you any theory?" I asked. "Yes, or at least all the experts whom we consulted have a theory. It is that she slipped down the saloon in the dark, gained the deck, and thence fell or threw herself into the Nile, which of course would have carried her body away. As you may have heard, the Nile is full of bodies. I myself saw 2 of them during that journey. The Egyptian police and others were so convinced that this was what had happened that, notwithstanding the reward of £1,000 which I offered for any valuable information, they could scarcely be persuaded to continue the search. You said that a wind was blowing, and I understand that the shores are sandy, so I suppose that all footprints would have been filled in?" He nodded, and I went on. "What is your own belief? Do you think she was drowned?" he countered my query with another of, "What do you think?" I? Oh, although I have no right to say so, I don't think at all. I am quite sure that she was not drowned, that she is living at this moment. Where? As to that you had better inquire of our friends Harût and Marût, I answered dryly. What have you got to go on, Quatermain? There is no clue. On the contrary, I hold that there are a good many clues. The whole English part of the story in which we were concerned, and the threats those mysterious persons uttered are the first and greatest of these clues. The second is the fact that your hiring of the dahabeeyah, regardless of expense, was known a long time before your arrival in Egypt, for I suppose you did so in your own name, which is not exactly that of Smith or Brown. The third is your wife's sleepwalking propensities, which would have made it quite easy for her to be drawn ashore under some kind of mesmeric influence. The fourth is that you had seen Arabs mounted on camels upon the banks of the Nile. The fifth is the heavy sleep you say held everybody on board that particular night, which suggests to me that your food may have been drugged. The sixth is the apathy displayed by those employed in the search, which suggests to me that some person or persons in authority may have been bribed, as is common in the East, or perhaps frightened with threats of bewitchment. The seventh is that a night was chosen when a wind blew which would obliterate all spoor whether of men or of swiftly travelling camels. These are enough to begin with, though doubtless if I had time to think I could find others. You might remember too that although the journey would be long, this country of the Kender can doubtless be reached from the Sudan by those who know the road, as well as from southern or eastern Africa. Then you think that my wife has been kidnapped by those villains Harût and Marût? Of course. The villains is a strong term to apply to them. They may be quite honest men according to their peculiar lights, as indeed I expect they are. Remember that they serve a god or a fetish, or rather, as they believe, a god in a fetish, who to them doubtless is a very terrible master, especially when, as I understand, that god is threatened by a rival god. Why do you say that, Quatermain? By way of answer I repeated to him the story which Hans said he had heard from the old woman at Beza, the town of the Mazitu. Lord Ragnall listened with the deepest interest, then said in an agitated voice: "That is a very strange tale, but has it struck you, Quatermain, that if your suppositions are correct, one of the most terrible circumstances connected with my case is that our child should have chanced to come to its dreadful death through the wickedness of an elephant?" "That curious coincidence has struck me most forcibly, Lord Ragnall. At the same time I do not see how it can be set down as more than a coincidence, since the elephant which slaughtered your child was certainly not that called Jana. To suppose because there is a war between an elephant god and a child god somewhere in the heart of Africa, that therefore another elephant can be so influenced that it kills a child in England, is to my mind out of all reason. That is what I said to him, as I did not wish to introduce a new horror into the affair that was already horrible enough. But recollecting that these priests Harût and Marût believed the mother of this murdered infant to be none other than the oracle of their worship, though how this chanced passed my comprehension, and therefore the great enemy of the evil elephant god, I confess that at heart I felt afraid. If any powers of magic, black or white or both, were mixed up with the matter as my experiences in England seemed to suggest, who could say what might be their exact limits? As, however, it has been demonstrated again and again by the learned that no such thing as African magic exists, this line of thought appeared to be too foolish to follow. So passing it by, I asked Lord Ragnall to continue. "For over a month," he went on, "I stopped in Egypt waiting till emissaries who had been sent to the chiefs of various tribes in the Sudan and elsewhere returned with the news that nothing whatsoever had been seen of a white woman travelling in the company of natives, nor had they heard of any such woman being sold as a slave. Also through the Khedive, on whom I was able to bring influence to bear by help of the British Government, I caused many harems in Egypt to be visited, entirely without result. After this, leaving the inquiry in the hands of the British Consul, and a firm of French lawyers, though in truth all hope had gone, I returned to England whither I had already sent Lady Longden, broken hearted, for it occurred to me as possible that my wife might have drifted or been taken thither. But there too there was no trace of her, or of anybody who could possibly answer to her description. So at last I came to the conclusion that her bones must lie somewhere at the bottom of the Nile, and gave way to despair. "Always a foolish thing to do," I remarked. "You will say so indeed when you hear the end, Quatermain. My bereavement and the sleeplessness which it caused preyed upon me so much, for now that the child was dead my wife was everything to me, that I will tell you the truth. My brain became affected and like Job I cursed God in my heart and determined to die. Indeed I should have died by my own hand had it not been for Savage. I had procured the laudanum and loaded the pistol with which I proposed to shoot myself immediately after it was swallowed, so that there might be no mistake. One night, only a couple of months or so ago, Quatermain, I sat in my study at Ragnall with the doors locked as I thought, writing a few final letters before I did the deed. The last of them was just finished about 12 when, hearing a noise, I looked up and saw Savage standing before me. I asked him angrily how he came there. I suppose he must have had another key to one of the other doors, and what he wanted. Ignoring the first part of the question, he replied: "My lord, I have been thinking over our trouble." He was with us in Egypt. "I have been thinking so much that it has got hold of my sleep. Tonight, as you said you did not want me any more, and I was tired, I went to bed early and had a dream. I dreamed that we were once more in the shrubbery, as happened some years ago, and that the little African gent who shot like a book was showing us the traces of those two black men, just as he did when they tried to steal her ladyship. Then in my dream I seemed to go back to bed, and that beastly snake which we found lying under the parcel in the road seemed to follow me. When I had got to sleep again, all in the dream, there it was, standing on its tail at the end of the bed, hissing till it woke me. Then it spoke in good English and not in African, as might have been expected. 'Savage,' it said, 'get up and dress yourself and go at once and tell his lordship to travel to Natal and find Mr. Allan Quatermain. You may remember that was the African gentleman's name, my lord, which, with so many coming and going in this great house, I had quite forgotten until I had the dream. Find Mr. Allan Quatermain,' that slimy reptile went on, opening and shutting its mouth for all the world like a Christian making a speech, 'for he will have something to tell him as to that which has made a hole in his heart that is now filled with the 7 devils. Be quick, Savage, and don't stop to put on your shirt or your tie. I have not, my lord, as you may see. He is shut up in the study, but you know how to get into it. If he will not listen to you, let him look round the study, and he will see something which will tell him that this is a true dream.' Then the snake vanished, seeming to wiggle down upon the left bottom bedpost, and I woke up in a cold sweat, my lord, and did what it had told me." Those were his very words, Quatermain, for I wrote them down afterwards while they were fresh in my memory, and you see here they are in my pocket book. Well, I answered him rather brusquely, I am afraid, for a crazed man who is about to leave the world under such circumstances does not show at his best when disturbed almost in the very act, to the edge of which a long agony has brought him. I told him that all his dream of snakes seemed ridiculous, which obviously it was, and was about to send him away, when it occurred to me that the suggestion it conveyed that I should put myself in communication with you was not ridiculous in view of the part you had already played in the story. "Very far from ridiculous," I interpolated. "To tell the truth," went on Lord Ragnall, "I had already thought of doing the same thing, but somehow beneath the pressure of my imminent grief the idea was squeezed out of my mind, perhaps because you were so far away and I did not know if I could find you even if I tried." Pausing for a moment before I dismissed Savage, I rose from the desk at which I was writing and began to walk up and down the room thinking what I would do. I am not certain if you saw it when you were at Ragnall, but it is a large room, 50 feet long or so, though not very broad. It has two fireplaces, in both of which fires were burning brightly on this night, and it was lit by 4 standing lamps beside that upon my desk. Now between these fireplaces, in a kind of niche in the wall, and a little in the shadow because none of the lamps was exactly opposite to it, hung a portrait of my wife which I had caused to be painted by a fashionable artist when first we became engaged. "I remember it," I said, "or rather I remember its existence. I did not see it because a curtain hung over the picture, which Savage told me you did not wish to be looked at by anybody but yourself. At the time I remarked to him, or rather to myself, that to veil the likeness of a living woman in such a way seemed to me a rather ill-omened thing to do, though why I should have thought it so I do not know." "You are quite right, Quatermain. I had that foolish fancy, a lover's freak, I suppose. When we married the curtain was removed, although the brass rod on which it hung was left by some oversight. On my return to England after my loss, however, I found that I could not bear to look upon this lifeless likeness of one who had been taken from me so cruelly, and I caused it to be replaced. I did more. In order that it might not be disturbed by some dusting housemaid, I myself made it fast with 3 or 4 tin tacks which I remember I drove through the velvet stuff into the panelling, using a fire iron as a hammer. At the time I thought it a good job, although by accident I struck the nail of the 3rd finger of my left hand so hard that it came off. Look, it is not quite finished growing again," and he showed the finger on which the new nail was still in process of formation. Well, as I walked up and down the room some impulse caused me to look towards the picture. To my astonishment I saw that it was no longer veiled, although to the best of my belief the curtain had been drawn over it as lately as that afternoon. Indeed, I could have sworn that this was so. I called to Savage to bring the lamp that stood upon my table, and by its light made an examination. The curtain was drawn back very tidily, being fastened in its place clear of the little alcove by means of a thin brass chain. Also along one edge of it, that which I had nailed to the panelling, the tin tacks were still in their places, that is, 3 of them were. The 4th I found afterwards upon the floor. "She looks beautiful, doesn't she, my lord?" said Savage, "and please God so we shall find her somewhere in the world." I did not answer him or even remark upon the withdrawal of the curtain, as to which indeed I never made an inquiry. I suppose that it was done by some zealous servant while I was pretending to eat my dinner. There were 1 or 2 new ones in the house whose names and appearance I did not know. What impressed itself upon my mind was that the face which I never expected to see again on the earth, even in a picture, was once more given to my eyes, it mattered not how. Thus, in my excited state, for laudanum waiting to be swallowed and a pistol at full cock for firing do not induce calmness in a man already most mad, at any rate until they have fulfilled their offices, did in truth appear to me to be something of the nature of a sign, such as that spoken of in Savage's idiotic dream, which I was to find if I looked round the study. "Savage," I said, "I don't think much of your dreams about snakes that talk to you, but I do think that it might be well to see Mr. Quatermain. Today is Sunday and I believe that the African mail sails on Friday. Go to town early tomorrow and book passages." Also I told him to see various gunsmiths and bid them send down a selection of rifles and other weapons for me to choose from, as I did not know whither we might wander in Africa, and to make further necessary arrangements. All of these things he did, and here we are. "Yes," I answered reflectively, "here you are. What is more, here is your luggage, of which there seems to be enough for a regiment," and I pointed to a Scotch cart piled up with baggage and followed by a long line of Kaffirs carrying sundry packages upon their heads that, marshalled by Savage, had halted at my gate. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Start. That evening, when the baggage had been disposed of and locked up in my little stable, and arrangements were made for the delivery of some cases containing tinned foods, etc., which had proved too heavy for the Scotch cart, Lord Ragnall and I continued our conversation. First, however, we unpacked the guns and checked the ammunition, of which there was a large supply, with more to follow. A beautiful battery they were, of all sorts from elephant guns down to the most costly and best finished that money could buy at the time. It made me shiver to think what the bill for them must have been, while their appearance when they were put together and stood in a long line against the wall of my sitting room moved old Hans to a kind of ecstasy. For a long while he contemplated them, patting the stocks one after the other and giving each a name as though they were all alive, then exclaimed: "With such weapons as these the Baas could kill the devil himself. Still, let the Baas bring in Tombi with him," a favourite old rifle of mine and a mere toy in size, that had however done me good service in the past, as those who have read what I have written in Marie and the Holy Flower may remember. For, Baas, after all, the wife of one's youth often proves more to be trusted than the fine young ones a man buys in his age. Also one knows all her faults. But who can say how many there may be hidden up in a new woman however beautifully they are tattooed?" And he pointed to the elaborate engraving upon the guns. I translated this speech to Lord Ragnall. It made him laugh, at which I was glad, for up till then I had not seen him even smile. I should add that in addition to these sporting weapons, there were no fewer than 50 military rifles of the best make. They were large bore Snyders that had just been put upon the market, and with them, packed in tin cases, a great quantity of ammunition. Although the regulations were not so strict then as they are now, I met with a great deal of difficulty in getting all this armament through the customs. Lord Ragnall, however, had letters from the Colonial Office to such authorities as ruled Natal, and on our giving a joint undertaking that they were for defensive purposes only in unexplored territory and not for sale, they were allowed through. Fortunate did it prove for us in after days that this matter was arranged. That night before we went to bed I narrated to Lord Ragnall all the history of our search for the Holy Flower, which he seemed to find very entertaining. Also I told him of my adventures, to me far more terrible, as chairman of the bona fide gold mine, and of their melancholy end. "The lesson of which is," he remarked when I had finished, "that because a man is a master of one trade, it does not follow that he is a master of another. You are, I should judge, one of the finest shots in the world. You are also a great hunter and explorer. But when it comes to companies, Quatermain, still," he went on, "I ought to be grateful to that bona fide gold mine, since I gather that had it not been for it and for your rascally friend Mr. Jacob, I should not have found you here." "No," I answered, "it is probable that you would not, as by this time I might have been far in the interior where a man cannot be traced and letters do not reach him." Then he made a few pointed inquiries about the affairs of mine, noting my answers down in his pocket book. I thought this odd, but concluded that he wished to verify my statements before entering into close companionship with me, since for aught he knew I might be the largest liar in the world and a swindler to boot. So I said nothing, even when I heard through a roundabout channel on the morrow that he had sought an interview with the late secretary of the defunct company. A few days later, for I may as well finish with this matter at once, the astonishing object of these inquiries was made clear to me. One morning I found upon my table a whole pile of correspondence, at the sight of which I groaned, feeling sure that it must come from Duns and be connected with that infernal mine. Curiosity and a desire to face the worst, however, led me to open the first letter which, as it happened, proved to be from that very shareholder who had proposed a vote of confidence in me at the winding up meeting. By the time that it was finished my eyes were swimming, and really I felt quite faint. It ran: "Honoured Sir, I knew that I was putting my money on the right horse when I said the other day that you were one of the straightest that ever ran. Well, I have got the cheque sent to me by the lawyer on your account, being payment in full for every farthing I invested in the bona fide gold mine, and I can only say that it is uncommonly useful, for that business had pretty well cleaned me out. God bless you, Mr. Quatermain." I opened another letter, and another, and another. They were all to the same effect. Bewildered, I went out to the step, where I found Hans with an epistle in his hand which he requested me to be good enough to read. I read it. It was from a well-known firm of local lawyers and said: "On behalf of Allan Quatermain, Esquire, we beg to enclose a draft for the sum of £650, being the value of the interest in the Bonafide Gold Mine, Limited, in liquidation, which stands in your name on the books of the company. Please sign enclosed receipt and return same to us." Yes, and there was a draft for £650 sterling. I explained the matter to Hans, or rather I translated the document, adding: "You see, you have got your money back again. But Hans, I never sent it. I don't know where it comes from." "Is it money, Baas?" asked Hans, surveying the draft with suspicion. "It looks very much like another bit of paper for which I paid money." Again I explained, reiterating that I knew nothing of the transaction. "Well, Baas," he said, "if you did not send it, someone did. Perhaps your father, the reverend predicant, who sees that you are in trouble and wishes to wash your name white again. Meanwhile, Baas, please put that bit of paper in your pocket book and keep it for me, for otherwise I might be tempted to buy square face with it." "No," I answered. "You can now buy back your land or some other land, and there will be no need for you to come with me to the country of the Kender." Hans thought a moment and then very deliberately began to tear up the draft. Indeed, I was only just in time to save it from destruction. "If the Baas is going to turn me off because of this paper," he said, "I will make it small and eat it." "You silly old fool," I said as I possessed myself of the cheque. Then the conversation was interrupted, for who should appear but Sammy, my old cook, who began in his pompous language: "The perfect rectitude of your conduct, Mr. Quatermain, moves me to the deepest gratitude, though indeed I wish that I had put something into the food of the knave Jacob who beguiled us all, that would have caused him internal pangs of a severe if not of a very dangerous order. My holding in the gold mine was not extensive, but the unpaid bill of the said Jacob and his friends—" Here I cut him short and fled, since I saw yet another shareholder galloping to the gate, and behind him two more in a spider. First I took refuge in my room, my idea being to put away that pile of letters. In so doing I observed that there was one still unopened. Half mechanically I took it from the envelope and glanced at its contents. They were word for word identical with those of that addressed to Mr. Hans Hottentot, only my name was at the bottom of it instead of that of Hans, and the cheque was for £1,500, the amount I had paid for the shares I held in the venture. Feeling as though my brain were in a melting pot, I departed from the house into a patch of native bush that in those days still grew upon the slope of the hill behind. Here I sat myself down, as I had often done before when there was a knotty point to be considered, aimlessly watching a lovely emerald cuckoo flashing, a jewel of light, from tree to tree, while I turned all this fairy godmother business over in my mind. Of course it soon became clear to me. Lord Ragnall in this case was the little old lady with a wand, the touch of which could convert worthless share certificates into bank notes of their face value. I remembered now that his wealth was said to be phenomenal, and after all the cash capital of the company was quite small. But the question was, could I accept his bounty? I returned to the house where the first person whom I met was Lord Ragnall himself, just arrived from some interview about the 50 Snider rifles, which were still in bond. I told him solemnly that I wished to speak to him, whereon he remarked in a cheerful voice: "Advance, friend, and all's well." I don't know that I need to set out the details of the interview. He waited till I had got through my halting speech of mingled gratitude and expostulation, then remarked: "My friend, if you will allow me to call you so, it is quite true that I have done this because I wished to do it, but it is equally true that to me it is a small thing, to be frank, scarcely a month's income. What I have saved travelling on that ship to Natal would pay for it all. Also I have weighed my own interest in the matter, for I am anxious that you should start upon this hazardous journey of ours up country with a mind absolutely free from self-reproach or any money care, for thus you will be able to do me better service. Therefore I beg that you will say no more of the episode. I have only one thing to add, namely that I have myself bought up at par value a few of the debentures. The price of them will pay the lawyers and the liquidation fees. Moreover, they give me a status as a shareholder, which will enable me to sue Mr. Jacob for his fraud, to which business I have already issued instructions. For please understand that I have not paid off any shares still standing in his name or in those of his friends. Here I may add that nothing ever came out of this action, for the lawyers found themselves unable to serve any writ upon that elusive person, Mr. Jacob, who by then had probably adopted the name of some other patriarch. Please put it all down as a rich man's whim, he concluded. I can't call that a whim which has returned £1,500 odd to my pocket that I had lost upon a gamble, Lord Ragnall. Do you remember, Quatermain, how you won £250 upon a gamble at my place, and what you did with it, which sum probably represented to you 20 or 50 times what it would to me? Also, if that argument does not appeal to you, may I remark that I do not expect you to give me your services as a professional hunter and guide for nothing. Ah, I answered, fixing on this point and ignoring the rest. Now we come to business. If I may look upon this amount as salary, a very handsome salary by the way, paid in advance, you taking the risks of my dying or becoming incapacitated before it is earned, I will say no more of the matter. If not, I must refuse to accept what is an unearned gift. I confess, Quatermain, that I did not regard it in that light, though I might have been willing to call it a retaining fee. However, do not let us wrangle about money any more. We can always settle our accounts when the bill is added up, if ever we reach so far. Now, let us come to more important details. So we fell to discussing the scheme, route and details of our proposed journey. Expenditure being practically no object, there were several plans open to us. We might sail up the coast and go by Kilwa, as I had done on the search for the Holy Flower, or we might retrace the line of our retreat from the Mazitu country which ran through Zululand. Again, we might advance by whatever road we selected with a small army of drilled and disciplined retainers, trusting to force to break a way through to the Kender. Or we might go practically unaccompanied, relying on our native wit and good fortune to attain our ends. Each of these alternatives had so much to recommend it and yet presented so many difficulties that after long hours' discussion, for this talk was renewed again and again, I found it quite impossible to decide upon any one of them, especially as in the end Lord Ragnall always left the choice with its heavy responsibilities to me. At length in despair I opened the window and whistled twice on a certain low note. A minute later Hans shuffled in, shaking the wet off the new corduroy clothes which he had bought upon the strength of his return to affluence, for it was raining outside, and squatted himself down upon the floor at a little distance. In the shadow of the table which cut off the light from the hanging lamp he looked, I remember, exactly like an enormous and antique toad. I threw him a piece of tobacco which he thrust into his corn-cob pipe and lit it with a match. "The Baas called me," he said when it was drawing to his satisfaction. "What does Baas want of Hans?" "Light in darkness," I replied, playing on his native name, and proceeded to set out the whole case to him. He listened without a word, then asked for a small glass of gin, which I gave him doubtfully. Having swallowed this at a gulp as though it were water, he delivered himself briefly to this effect: "I think the Baas will do well not to go to Kilwa, since it means waiting for a ship or hiring one. Also there may be more slave traders there by now who will bear him no love because of a lesson he taught them a while ago. On the other hand, the road through Zululand is open, though it be long, and there the name of Macumazana is one well known. I think also that the Baas would do well not to take too many men, who make marching slow, only a wagon or two and some drivers which might be sent back when they can go no farther. From Zululand messengers can be dispatched to the Mazitu who love you, and Bausi, or whoever is king there today, will order bearers to meet us on the road. until which time we can hire other bearers in Zululand. The old woman at Beza Town told me, moreover, as you will remember, that the Kender are a very great people who live by themselves and will allow none to enter their land, which is bordered by deserts. Therefore no force that you could take with you and feed upon a road without water would be strong enough to knock down their gates like an elephant, and it seems better that you should try to creep through them like a wise snake, although they appear to be shut in your face. Perhaps also they will not be shut, since did you not say that two of their great doctors promised to meet you and guide you through them?" "Yes," I interrupted, "I dare say it will be easier to get in than to get out of Kendahland." "Last of all, Baas, if you take many men armed with guns, the black part of the Kendah people of whom I told you will perhaps think you come to make war, whatever the white Kendah may say, and kill us all, whereas if we be but a few perchance they will let us pass in peace. I think that is all, Baas. Let the Baas and the Lord Igeza forgive me if my words are foolish." Here I should explain that Igeza was the name which the natives had given to Lord Ragnall because of his appearance. The word means a handsome person in the Zulu tongue. Savage they called Bena. I don't know why. Bena in Zulu means to push out the breast, and it may be that the name was a roundabout allusion to the proud appearance of the dignified savage, or possibly it had some other recondite signification. At any rate, Lord Ragnall, Hans and myself knew the splendid savage thenceforward by the homely appellation of Beans. His master said it suited him very well because he was so green. "This advice seems wise, Hans. Go now." "No, no more gin," I answered. As a matter of fact, careful consideration convinced us it was so wise that we acted upon it down to the last detail. So it came about that one fine afternoon about a fortnight later, for hurry as we would our preparations took a little time, we trekked for Zululand over the sandy roads that ran from the outskirts of Durban. Our baggage and stores were stowed in two half-tented wagons, very good wagons since everything we had with us was the best that money could buy, the after part of which served us as sleeping places at night. Hans sat on the voerkis or driving seat of one of the wagons. Lord Ragnall, Savage and I were mounted upon salted horses, that is, horses which had recovered from and were therefore supposed to be proof against the dreadful sickness, valuable and docile animals which were trained to shooting. At our start a little contretemps occurred. To my amazement I saw Savage, who insisted upon continuing to wear his funereal upper servant's cutaway coat, engaged in grim determination in mounting his steed from the wrong side. He got into the saddle somehow, but there was worse to follow. The horse, astonished at such treatment, bolted a little way, Savage sawing at its mouth. Lord Ragnall and I cantered after it past the wagons, fearing disaster. All of a sudden it swerved violently and Savage flew into the air, landing heavily in a sitting posture. "Poor Beans!" ejaculated Lord Ragnall as we sped forward. "I expect there is an end of his journeyings." To our surprise, however, we saw him leap from the ground with the most marvellous agility and begin to dance about, slapping at his posterior parts and shouting, "Take it off! Kill it!" A few seconds later we discovered the reason. The horse had shied at a sleeping puff adder which was curled up in the sand of that little frequented road, and on this puff adder Savage had descended with so much force, for he weighed 13 stone, that the creature was squashed quite flat and never stirred again. This, however, he did not notice in his agitation, being convinced indeed that it was hanging to him behind like a bulldog. "Snakes, my lord!" he exclaimed, when at last after careful search we demonstrated to him that the adder had died before it could come into action. "I hate 'em, my lord, and the aunts." He said aunts. "Me? If ever I get out of this I'll go and live in Ireland, my lord, where they say there ain't none. But it isn't likely that I shall," he added mournfully, "for the omen is horrid." "On the contrary," I answered, "it is splendid, for you have killed the snake and not the snake you. The dog it was that died, Savage." After this the Kaffirs gave Savage a second very long name, which meant "he who sits down on snakes and makes them flat." Having remounted him to his horse, which was standing patiently a few yards away, at length we got off. I lingered a minute behind the others to give some directions to my old Griqua gardener, Jack, who snivelled at parting with me, and to take a last look at my little home. Alack! I feared it might be the last indeed, knowing as I did that this was a dangerous enterprise upon which I found myself embarked, I who had vowed that I would be done with danger. With a lump in my throat I turned from the contemplation of that peaceful dwelling and happy garden in which each tree and plant was dear to me, and waving a good-bye to Jack, cantered on to where Ragnall was waiting for me. "I am afraid this is a rather sad hour for you, who are leaving your little boy and your home," he said gently, "to face unknown perils." "Not so sad as others I have passed," I answered, "and perils are my daily bread in every sense of the word. Moreover, whatever it is for me, it is for you also. No, Quatermain, for me it is an hour of hope, a faint hope I admit, but the only one left, for the letters I got last night from Egypt and England report that no clue whatsoever has been found, and indeed that the search for any has been abandoned. Yes, I follow the last star left in my sky, and if it sets I hope that I may set also, at any rate to this world. Therefore I am happier than I have been for months, thanks to you," and he stretched out his hand, which I shook. It was a token of friendship and mutual confidence which I am glad to say nothing that happened afterwards ever disturbed for a moment. End of chapter 8.